Ukraine just struck the depot supplying all of Russia's front line, and Moscow could do nothing. Something just happened that the entire world's military analysts are still trying to process, and if you are watching this right now, you need to stop everything and pay attention because this is not a small development, this is a turning point. Ukraine just struck the central supply depot that has been feeding ammunition, fuel, artillery shells, and equipment to every single Russian unit operating along the entire eastern front line, and Moscow's response tells you exactly how badly this hit them. I am going to walk you through exactly what happened, exactly what was inside that depot, exactly why this strike is different from every other Ukrainian long-range attack we have covered, and exactly what it means for the next phase of this war. Because by the time you finish watching this, you are going to understand why military planners in Washington, Warsaw, and Kyiv are calling this the single most strategically significant strike Ukraine has executed since the war began. Stay with me. Let's start with what Ukraine actually hit. This was not a random ammunition warehouse. Somewhere in the Russian rear, this was not a fuel depot that Russia could replace in a week. This was a primary logistics hub, a centralized supply node that military doctrine experts describe as the lifeblood of a modern frontline operation. Think of it this way. Every tank that fired a shell in Donetsk this week drew that shell from a chain that ran through this depot. Every Russian soldier who received a hot meal, a medical kit, or a replacement rifle magazine in the past 3 months, that supply passed through this facility or through nodes directly dependent on it. Ukraine did not just blow up a building. Ukraine just cut the artery. Now let me give you the specific details because the numbers here are extraordinary and every single one of them matters. Ukrainian military intelligence sources confirmed that the depot held reserves of artillery shells, ballistic missile components, armored vehicle spare parts, fuel reserves estimated at tens of thousands of liters, and drone components that Russia had been stockpiling specifically for its summer offensive push. This was not a depot operating at normal capacity. Russia had been deliberately concentrating supplies here ahead of what Western intelligence assessments had flagged as a planned major escalation along the Donetsk contact line. Ukraine did not stumble into this target. Ukraine hunted it, and here is where the story gets strategically remarkable, because the way Ukraine found this depot, tracked it, confirmed it, and then hit it tells you everything about how dramatically Ukrainian intelligence and strike capabilities have evolved since February 2022, according to sources familiar with Ukrainian operational planning. The targeting process for this strike involved weeks of satellite reconnaissance, signals intelligence collection, drone surveillance, and cross-referencing of logistics movement patterns. Ukraine watched Russian supply trucks rolling in. Ukraine watched the volume of deliveries increase. Ukraine identified the pattern shift that indicated this was no longer a routine depot but a pre-offensive staging point, and then Ukraine waited for the optimal window, and then Ukraine hit it with a precision that the Russian military genuinely did not believe Ukraine possessed. When this war began, let that sink in for a second, when Russia launched its full-scale invasion in February 2022, the Kremlin's generals calculated they were facing a military that could be defeated in 72 hours. They calculated that Ukrainian precision strike capability against deep rear targets did not exist at any meaningful scale. They were wrong about the 72 hours, and they are finding out today just how catastrophically wrong they were about the long-range strike capability. Now let's talk about what the fires at this depot actually revealed, because the secondary explosions that followed the initial strike gave military analysts something they almost never get: real-time window into exactly what was stored there. When an ammunition depot of this scale is struck, the secondary explosions follow a specific pattern. Artillery shell cook-offs produce a distinctive signature. Fuel fires burn differently from propellant fires. Missile components, when they ignite, produce visible plumes that satellite and aerial sensors can analyze and characterize. Based on the explosion sequence and fire signatures that were recorded and analyzed in the hours following the strike, military experts assessing the evidence concluded that this depot was holding a significantly larger reserve than Russian logistics reporting had indicated even to their own field commanders, which tells you something important about how Russia manages its supply chain. Russia does not always tell its frontline commanders how much is actually available in the rear. Information is controlled, compartmentalized, managed as a political tool as much as a military one. So when those secondary explosions kept going for hours, when fires burned through the night and into the following morning, some Russian brigade commanders along the Eastern Front were learning for the first time just how exposed their supply situation had become. Now here is the part of this story that I want you to pay very close attention to, because this is where the strategic picture shifts from impressive to genuinely alarming for the Kremlin. Russia's logistics system along the Eastern Front is not designed with redundancy the way modern NATO doctrine would prescribe. NATO military doctrine requires that a logistics network have multiple alternative supply routes, distributed storage nodes, and the ability to reroute around a destroyed hub within hours. Russia's system along this front was built around centralization. Centralization is more efficient when everything is working. Centralization is catastrophic when a central node is destroyed. The reason Russia built it this way is partly historical, rooted in Soviet-era military logistics doctrine that prioritized mass and concentration over resilience and redundancy, and partly because Russia did not seriously plan for Ukrainian long-range precision strikes reaching this deep. That planning failure is now a burning crater. Now let me bring you the immediate operational consequences, because this is what matters for the battlefield picture over the next 30 to 90 days. Russian artillery. Units along the Donetsk contact line are already operating at reduced shell availability. This was documented before this strike. Multiple frontline analysis sources tracking Russian fire rates had noted a measurable reduction in outgoing artillery volume in certain sectors in the weeks preceding this attack. Now those same units have just lost their primary resupply node, the shells that were sitting in that depot that were scheduled for delivery to frontline. Artillery parks in the coming days and weeks are gone. Russia can rebuild, Russia will rebuild, but rebuilding takes time, and in the military mathematics of attritional warfare, time is ammunition. Every day that Russian artillery fires at a reduced rate is a day that Ukrainian defensive positions have more breathing room. Every day that Russian armored units wait for replacement parts is a day that Ukrainian engineering teams can reinforce obstacles and fortifications. Every day that Russian logistics officers scramble to reroute supplies through alternative nodes is a day that Ukrainian targeting teams are watching those alternative routes and mapping the new patterns. Ukraine is not fighting for a single dramatic battlefield moment. Ukraine is fighting to systematically degrade Russia's ability to sustain offensive pressure, and this strike is the clearest single example of that strategy working at full operational scale that we have seen in the entire 4 years of this conflict. Now let's talk about how Russia responded, because Moscow's reaction tells you more about the actual impact of this strike than any official Ukrainian statement could. Russia's initial public response was silence, not the kind of silence that follows a minor incident. The kind of silence that follows something large enough that the information managers need time to work out what story to tell. When Russian state media eventually addressed the situation, the framing was carefully controlled. A routine fire at a logistics facility, casualties being assessed, situation under control, military. Analysts who track Russian information operations recognized the signature immediately. This is the exact language pattern Russia uses when something has gone badly enough that they cannot deny it entirely but cannot afford to let their own population understand the actual scale. Compare this to how Russia reports Ukrainian losses, which come with dramatic footage, named commanders, exact coordinates, and immediate amplification. Across every state media channel, the contrast is not subtle. And meanwhile on the ground, in occupied territories near the strike site, local residents were reporting on social media channels that explosions continued for an extended period, that the glow from the fires was visible from significant distances, and that emergency response vehicles had been deployed in numbers inconsistent with a routine industrial incident. Ordinary people living under Russian occupation, people who have learned to read the real situation from what they see with their own eyes rather than what state television tells them, understood immediately that something significant had happened. Now I want to address the question that I know many of you are already thinking about, which is how does Russia replace what it just lost and how quickly can it do so? Russia does not lack for ammunition production. That has to be stated clearly and honestly, because overstating the impact of this strike would be as misleading as understating it. Russia's defense industry has been on a war economy footing since mid-2022. Russian factories are producing artillery shells, drone components, and missile systems at rates that have surprised Western intelligence assessments more than once. Russia also has the North Korean supply pipeline, which has delivered a significant volume of artillery ammunition that has supplemented Russian domestic production throughout the past year, so Russia will resupply. The question is not whether Russia can replace what was destroyed. The question is how long it takes, what routes it uses, and whether those replacement routes can be interdicted before they establish themselves as functioning alternatives. And that is precisely the operational challenge that Ukrainian intelligence and strike forces are now focused on, because Ukraine did not hit this depot and then stop. Ukraine hit this depot and then immediately shifted its targeting apparatus to watch the response, map the rerouting, identify the alternative nodes, and prepare the next set of strikes. This is not a one-time event, this is a campaign. And understanding it as a campaign rather than as an isolated strike is essential to understanding why this matters so much strategically. Now let me give you the broader context of what Ukraine has been doing in the weeks surrounding this strike, because this depot attack did not happen in isolation in the same operational period. Ukrainian drone forces conducted sustained strikes against Russian railway infrastructure in the occupied territories and in Russian border regions directly. Railway infrastructure is the backbone of Russian military logistics. Russia moves the majority of its heavy military supplies by rail because the road network in the relevant regions cannot handle the volume of traffic that sustained frontline operations require. Ukraine has been systematically attacking rail bridges, rail yards, repair facilities, and locomotive maintenance depots. The cumulative effect of these strikes on Russian rail logistics has been documented by analysts tracking Russian military movement patterns. Trains are taking longer routes, delivery windows are extending, field commanders are reporting longer waits between resupply cycles, and now the primary depot at the end of those supply chains has been eliminated. The timing is not coincidental. Ukraine has been building toward this moment, degrading the system at multiple points simultaneously, and then striking the central node when the degradation of its supporting network would maximize the impact. This is not improvisation. This is operational planning executed at a level of sophistication that frankly was not visible in the Ukrainian military in the opening months of this war. Let me take a moment here to talk about what this means for the people actually fighting this war on the ground, because in the analysis of logistics and strategy, it can be easy to lose sight of the human reality. Every Russian artillery shell that does not reach the front line is a Ukrainian civilian or soldier who does not get killed by it. Every tank that runs out of fuel before it can advance is a Ukrainian defensive position that holds. Every Russian frontline unit that has to reduce its operational tempo because supplies are running short is a Ukrainian unit that has more time to dig in, fortify, and prepare. Logistics is not an abstraction. Logistics is what determines whether people live or die on a modern battlefield. And the Ukrainian soldiers who have been holding defensive lines under relentless Russian artillery pressure for months understand this in their bones in a way that no amount of analytical commentary can fully convey. This strike is for them. Now here is what I think happens next, and I want to be honest with you about the limits of what any analyst can predict about a dynamic conflict at this level of complexity. Russia will attempt to re-establish its forward supply capability as quickly as possible. It will use rail, road, and air logistics where possible to push supplies forward through alternative routes. It will attempt to disperse its storage, spreading reserves across a larger number of smaller sites to reduce the vulnerability to a single strike. This dispersion strategy is actually a tactical response to Ukrainian strike pressure that Russian logistics commanders have been increasingly forced to adopt, but dispersion has its own costs. Dispersed storage is harder to manage, slower to access, and requires more personnel and transport vehicles to service. It creates friction in the system, and in a high-tempo attritional war, friction kills offensive momentum. Ukraine's military planners understand this dynamic very well. They are not trying to destroy Russia's logistics capacity in a single stroke. They are trying to create enough friction, enough complexity, enough uncertainty in the Russian supply system that Russian offensive operations lose the sustained momentum they need to make significant territorial gains, and based on the battlefield reports from the past week, that strategy is showing real results. Russian advances in the Donetsk region have slowed measurably in the days following this strike. Combat engagement numbers remain high, meaning Russia is still attacking, but the depth of Russian advances, the rate of territorial change, has decreased. That is not coincidence. That is the beginning of the operational effect that this strike was designed to produce. Now let me give you the strategic picture from 30,000 feet because I think it is important to step back from the tactical details and see what this moment tells us about where this war is actually headed. 4 years into this conflict, Ukraine is fighting in a fundamentally different way than it was in 2022. In 2022, Ukraine was fighting for survival, improvising defenses, absorbing Russian offensive pressure, trying to prevent collapse. In 2023 and 2024, Ukraine was fighting to hold lines, counterattack, where possible, and demonstrate to Western partners that it could sustain the fight. In 2025 and now into 2026, Ukraine is fighting proactively, taking the offensive in the deep battle space, attacking Russian military capacity at its source rather than simply defending against its effects at the front line. This shift is profound, and it has happened because Ukraine has developed capabilities, intelligence infrastructure, strike systems, and operational doctrine that are genuinely unprecedented for a non-NATO military operating in this kind of conflict. The drone strike capability that Ukraine has built from the ground up over 3 years is now the most sophisticated of its kind anywhere in the world. Ukrainian drone operators are hitting targets 500, 600, 700 miles from the front line with a precision that the Russian Air Force cannot match against Ukrainian targets. Ukrainian intelligence collection has become so effective that Russian commanders have reportedly stopped using cell phones even in the deep rear because they know Ukrainian signals intelligence is tracking them. The Drone Academy strike that eliminated 65 Russian drone operator trainees a few weeks ago, the Black Sea Fleet headquarters strike in occupied Crimea, the bomber airfield strikes deep inside Russian territory, and now this depot, these are not lucky hits. These are the results of a systematic, patient, methodical targeting process executed by a military that has learned on the job faster than any military in modern history. And Moscow's response to all of it, the mass missile and drone attacks against Ukrainian cities, the hypersonic missiles against civilian neighborhoods, the shelling of playgrounds and churches and farm workers on tractors, that is not the behavior of a military that is winning the deep battle. That is the behavior of a military that cannot answer precision with precision, that cannot degrade Ukrainian strike capability by destroying Ukrainian strike capability, and so instead tries to break Ukrainian will by making Ukrainian civilians suffer enough to demand that their government stop. It has not worked in 4 years. The man who stood in the rubble of his Kyiv neighborhood after the most massive missile attack of the war and told a journalist he was not even scared anymore was telling Putin something that the Kremlin still refuses to hear. You cannot bomb these people into surrender. They have already paid a price that most of the world cannot imagine, and they are still fighting. Now here is the question that should be driving every policy conversation in Washington and Brussels right now. Ukraine just demonstrated that it can systematically destroy Russian military capacity at the source. It can find the depots. It can track the supply chains. It can hit the infrastructure that Russia's offensive operations depend on. What Ukraine needs to do this consistently and at the scale required to genuinely shift the strategic balance is sustained supply of the systems that enable long-range precision strike, drones and their components, intelligence sharing that gives Ukraine the targeting data to identify the next depot, the next rail yard, the next logistics hub, air defense systems that protect Ukrainian territory while its strike forces operate, because every time Ukraine conducts a deep strike like this one, Russia responds with mass attacks on Ukrainian cities, and Ukraine's ability to absorb those attacks without losing the industrial and human capacity to keep fighting depends directly on whether its air defense network can stay in the fight. These things are connected. Deep strike capability and air defense capability are not separate requirements. They are two sides of the same strategic equation. And every Western government that is still debating how much to provide, still calculating the political cost of full support against the political cost of Ukraine losing, needs to look at what just happened to that Russian depot and understand something clearly. Ukraine is not asking for permission to win. Ukraine is finding ways to win with whatever it has been given. The question is whether the West has the strategic vision to give Ukraine what it needs to turn this moment into a decisive shift rather than just a significant tactical success, because the next 72 hours on this battlefield will tell us a great deal about what Russia's response will be, whether Moscow absorbs this and adjusts, or whether Moscow responds with escalation that forces the West to finally make the decisions it has been avoiding. Watch the frontline reports from Donetsk. Watch the Russian logistics routes in the occupied territories. Watch whether Russia attempts to re-establish supply flow through alternative nodes. And watch whether Ukraine continues to target those alternatives as fast as Russia tries to build them, because that is the campaign that is actually deciding this war, not the dramatic headline moments, not the ceasefire proposals that collapse within hours, not the diplomatic meetings that produce nothing but prisoner swaps. The grinding, methodical, systematic destruction of Russia's ability to sustain the offensive that Putin believes will eventually force Ukraine to surrender. That is the fight that Ukraine is winning right now. One depot at a time, one supply chain at a time, one calculated, precise, devastatingly effective strike at a time. Share this video with someone who needs to understand what is actually happening in this war, because the mainstream coverage is missing the strategic picture entirely, and the strategic picture is this. Ukraine just proved that no Russian military installation, no logistics hub, no supply depot, no matter how deep in the rear, no matter how heavily defended, is safe from Ukrainian precision strike capability, and Moscow knows it, and there is nothing they can do about it. That is not nothing, that is everything.